Hello and welcome to a new video on YouTube channel of tutorialspedia.com. This video is part of a series of MuleSoft video tutorials where I'm covering different topics related to Mule 4. In this tutorial, I'm going to cover for each scope in Mule 4 and I will explain and demonstrate how we can use for each scope in Mule 4 to iterate on a collection. Let's have a look at the topics that are part of this video tutorial. First, I will have a theoretical overview of for each scope where I will explain what exactly for each scope is, why it is used. And then I will be implementing a use case, a simple use case where I will demonstrate the usage of for each scope. We will use a simple JSON with a collection of user objects, and then we will implement our message flow, and we will see that how we can iterate on this on different elements of this array, and we will observe the results in the debug mode. So before I proceed with the implementation of this use case, let's have a theoretical explanation of for each scope. So for each scope is one of the powerful scopes available in Anypoint platform or Anypoint Studio. And when you are implementing your message flows in Anypoint Studio, then often you have scenarios or use cases where you have to iterate on multiple objects or multiple elements inside a collection. For example, you can have a payload which contains multiple elements in the form of an array, or you can have any other type of collection, including maps, hash maps, or whatever type of collection you are using. And you want to iterate one by one on each element from within that collection. So for this type of scenarios, you have to use for each scope. What happens is that when you use for each scope from the core module, then each element from within the collection is iterated, and one by one you are iterating each element, and you can perform whatever actions using the different type of processors within your for each scope. And then once entire collection has been iterated, then once you reach out of the for each scope, then again you are able to access the entire payload again. So basically whatever changes that you do within your for each scope have a scope of that for each scope only. So outside the for each scope, you will still be able to access the original payload. So we will be seeing this in real and in practical in this video tutorial. Let me first show you the JSON that I'm going to take as an example for our implementation. So here is an array of user objects in the form of a JSON file that we are going to consider for this demonstration. We have a total of three users: user with the user ID 1, another user with the user ID 2, and then we have third user with the user ID 3. And we have username and and status for each of these users. So what we will be doing is that in our implementation we will be having HTTP listener, and we will be receiving this JSON as payload for the post method, and then we will be using for each scope, and we will be iterating one by one on each of these users. And based on the status, as you can see, two of the users have status active and one of the user has status as suspended. So based on the status value of each of these elements inside the array, we will be writing the data to different files. So we will be using write file operations, and we will create two files. One with the name active.json, where we will be writing those users which are active, and then we will have another file with the name others.json, where we will be writing those users which have status other than active. So in this way, we will be seeing that how we can iterate one by one in each of these elements. And for this purpose, in order to decide and segregate between active and inactive users, we will also use choice router for our implementation. So now that we have our use case clear, let's now move and jump into the implementation in Anypoint Studio. All right, so I have already opened Anypoint Studio. I'm going to create a new project. So I'll choose the option create a Mule project. Let's give it a name, and I will give it a name as tutorialpedia for each tutorial, and I will keep the default location for the project and just click on finish. So once you click on the finish button, then the project gets created and you will be able to see your project hierarchy under the package explorer. We can see that the project has been created, and now inside the configuration file, the default configuration file that gets created based on the name of the project, we are going to create our message flow. So let's go to HTTP and just drag and drop a listener, as it's going to receive the request in the form of a post request, where we are going to post our JSON data. So let me configure this listener, and in the connector configuration, I'll just click on this plus button, and here you will have to specify the host and port, and by default it runs on 8081 for the local host, and if you have this port available, you can just keep it. Otherwise, if you want, you can choose any other different available port. In my case, port 8081 is available, so I'll just click on OK. And in the path, I'm going to specify some path for this HTTP resource for the listener, and I'll choose slash for each. So this request will be entertained on localhost colon 8081 slash for each. And this is pretty much the configuration for HTTP listener. The next thing that I want to do is that I want to drag for each scope from the core module. So I'll just select it and drop it in the inside the process. Okay. So before I start configuring for each, let me explain a little bit about for each scope. So for each scope, if you see here, has different configuration options. With the first one as collection, where you have to specify what type of collection you want to iterate on. And here, if you don't specify anything, by default, it will be using payload as the collection. And we, in our case also, we are going to iterate on the payload. But if you want to explicitly specify, you can specify it as well. So I will specify payload, and then you can specify counter variable. What happens is that once inside for each your iterations are taking place, every iteration there is a counter variable that is getting implemented, and you can specify any name for this counter variable. And if you want to use it inside your for each scope, you can use as well. Maybe you have some business requirement or a use case where you want to populate this counter value to some JSON or some element, or you are going to write it to somewhere. Whatever you want to do, you can do that as well. And then you have batch size. So batch size by default is 1, and this batch size configuration determines that how many elements from within the collection you want to iterate, uh, you want to access and use in a single iteration. So by default, every iteration picks one element from the collection, but there can be use cases, or there can be scenarios where you want to increase your performance, and for the sake of efficiency, you want to access multiple elements from within the within the collection uh, as a single batch. For example, maybe you have 500 elements inside your collection, and you want that every iteration should pick 50 elements. In that way, you just want maximum a total of 10 iteration to traverse or to iterate on the entire collection of 500 elements. So that can be the scenario where you want to change the batch size. So we will keep it as 1 because we have a total of 3 elements only. And then you have root message variable name, which contains the root message, and this variable by default has the name root message, so we will keep it as is. Now inside the for each scope, what we want is that we want to have a choice router, because based on the value of the status that we have, as we can see, we have status for each user, either active or something else. So we want to have a choice router and decide based on the value of this status element that the data should be written to which specific file. So let's pick choice router from the core module and add it inside for each. So once you add your choice router, then you have options to put select the conditions. So we want the first condition that whenever payload dot status is equal to active, then we want to write it into a separate file, and in the default case we will write into another file. So when the status is active, we want to use write file operation from the file module and write the data to a file with the name active.json. So let's configure this, and in the connector configuration for this write file operation, I will click on plus, I will check this connection option and I will specify the working directory. So the working directory I want to specify is d/test. So this is the directory in my machine that I want to use. And then in the path, I want to specify the name of the file. So active.json. So this is the name that I want to specify for this file. And if you observe here in the content, by default, it's payload. So the payload value inside for each scope will contain the payload of the current iterated element every time. Sorry. So this means the first time when we will have the iteration, payload will contain this object with the user object with the user ID 1. Second iteration, it will have user with the user ID 2 with its username and status, of course. And third iteration, this user object with the user ID 3, username test and status active will be there in the payload. So in this way, every iteration, a different payload will be there inside this for each scope. So another thing that I want to do, if you see here, it has write mode as overwrite, which means every iteration it will be overwriting the data that has been previously written, but we want it to be appended, so we will choose append. So in this way, every time it iterates, it will be writing the data separately. Sorry, I did a mistake. This choice should be inside for each. Right. So we have for each, and inside for each, we are adding this choice router. So inside choice router, in the first when condition, we are writing to the file active.json, and I will add this write operation again in the default uh, choice as well. So in the default case, when the default condition, I mean when the user is not equal to active, so it will go to this default option, and here we are going to write it to we will write it to a different file with the name others.json. For that purpose, we will use the same base connector configuration, but in the path we will write to a different file. So we will choose others.json, and the body we will have same content as payload, and write mode we will choose as append. So in this way, what we are doing is that we are receiving the data in the listener. We are using for each scope, inside for each scope, we are using a choice router, and based on the value of the payload status, we are writing to different files. And after this, we want to have a transform message activity outside using which we want to return some data as a response. So this is outside for each, and here in this transform we are going to send just a simple message in the JSON format, and the message will be like this: data processed successfully. So this is just a simple message that we want to return. So in this case, if you observe, we have created our router inside the for each, and then we have written to different files. Now we are good to go by for testing of this implementation. I will run it in debug mode so that we are able to see how things are going. And let me put a breakpoint over here inside for each, and let me debug. I will run it in debug mode, so it will take a little time to get loaded into the runtime. In the meanwhile, we prepare our request. So I have already prepared the request on localhost colon 8081 slash for each. And in the body, if you see for this post request, we are passing all the three users. So we will be passing all the three users, and we will be observing how our implementation goes with for each scope. So now the project status is deployed. This means that we are good to go with the testing. Let's now go back to Postman and try to hit. And if I send the request, if you can see here that in the debug mode, it's in the breakpoint within the for each scope. So if it's within for each scope, we are expecting that the first element from our JSON should be there in the payload. And yes, we can see the payload, user ID 1, username tutorialspedia, and status active. So this is first user that has been accessed within the for each scope. And if you go to variables, you can see that the counter value is 1 because this is the first iteration. And if you go to root message, we can see all the details for the root message. Okay, so now if we press F6 and continue, we should be seeing that the data should get written to the file. You can see here that it has come to the first case because first condition for the user status active is true. So we will F6 to go next. And now you can see in the second iteration, it has gone to the second write operation in the default because now we have second user in our iteration getting iterated and user ID 2 and status is suspended, which is other than active. So it will be written into the others.json file. So let's F6 and the third user again is with the status active and this is user ID 3 with the username uh, test and status is active, and if you see that the counter value should be now 3. So let me show you the counter value. So if you go into the variable you can see that counter value is 3. So now it's going to write third element from uh, our collection. So if I click F6 and now it has gone out of the for each because it has completed and it has transformed the message. And if you go back, we should now see the response. So we can see 200 OK response and the message is data processed successfully. This means that our entire set of elements from within the collection have been processed successfully. Now if we go to the files, we can see that two files have been created. We have active.json and we have others.json. Let's open these files one by one. Let me open them with the notepad++. So this is active.json. You can see that two elements have been written here. User ID 1 with the status active and user ID 3 with the status active. And if I go to the second file with others.json, we can see that only one user, user ID 2, which has status suspended, has been written to this file. So in this way, we have implemented our solution in such a way that we are using for each scope and we are able to traverse or iterate on individual elements from within the collection and write the results to the file. In your scenario, this is just an example case and you might do some other actions. For example, maybe within these within for each scope for individual elements or individual payload of individual elements from within collection, you might be taking some other action. Maybe you want to send it to activemq, maybe you want to do some message enrichment, maybe you want to make other changes or any other actions that you want. But once you are done with all of the action, if you go out and if you see here in the transform message and if you try to access payload over here, you will see that entire payload will be back available over here. So payload inside was different. So if I just try to write payload, okay, let me write actual payload. I want to return actual payload over here and I will just write payload. So now I want to run this again with this change. So I want to see that once as when we were inside our iterations for individual elements, we were having payload for the individual elements. So once we go out of the for each, this payload in our response, this should be containing entire payload containing all of the three elements. So let me quickly, oh, it's already running in the debug mode. Okay, so if I try again, okay, so I will just process all the three, and now if I go back to Postman, then you can see that the message is data processed successfully and then we have actual payload. So entire payload is there. So in this way, no matter what you are doing inside your individual iterations within for each scope, once you go out of the for each scope, then you are able to access the original payload. So that's it from this video, and I hope that the information that has been conveyed to you and the message and the details that I tried to provide you using this tutorial are helpful. If you have any questions or any ambiguities, you can write in the comment section. And if you like this video, you can subscribe to the channel, as the channel contains many other videos for MuleSoft on different topics. And if you have any suggestion for the topics, you can write those as well in the comment section. Thank you very much.